So welcome back. This week, we are going to talk about the next Torah portion, which we refer to in Hebrew as Lecha, which literally means, there's a whole, um, somebody could spend a half an hour talking about all of the meanings of just those two words, but literally it means go forth for yourself. And it's a command that God gives. We're talking about the portion in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, from chapter 12, verse 1 to chapter 17, verse 27. So, as we did last time, what I'm going to do is give you a summary. There's some highlights I want to point out that jumped out at me as I was preparing. And then I want to focus most of our time on one particular character in this portion. Can anybody guess who I mean already? Do you know already who I mean?
Abraham.
Hagar. Exactly. Good, Natalie. Okay, so we're going to do a deep dive into the story of Hagar. But let's start with the summary of everything that happens. Now, the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis is narrative. It's all stories, as you know. And so a lot happens in each parsha, in each Torah portion, and they're not always chronological. Sometimes, you know how when you read a novel and it's told from multiple points of view, or there's different storylines that are woven into the novel. So the Torah portions and the Torah itself can be like that. But a lot of people really love the book of Bereshit, love the book of Genesis exactly because it is narrative. It's a story of people. So let's talk about where it picks up in chapter 12, verse 1. When we go into the commentary, we'll talk about what happened from the end of the last portion until the beginning of this one that isn't recorded regarding Abraham. Okay, now let's talk about the names for a second. You are probably aware that the two main characters of this parsha have different names. In the beginning of the parsha, they are called in English Abram and Sarai. I'm not actually even sure how you pronounce that. I call them Avram and Sarai, and you may hear me say Avraham. I mean, you know who I mean, Avraham and Sarah, but at this point in the story, they do not yet have those names. They get those names later. Okay. But here's the beginning. Lech Lecha. This is God's words. He's speaking to Avram at this point in the story, and he's commanding him, go from your land. This is the very, very famous, from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And there, God says to him, I'm going to make you into a great nation. So Avram and his wife, who is at this point called Sarai, are accompanied by a nephew. It's actually Sarai's nephew. I'm sorry, no, that's not true. It is Avram's nephew it's the son of his brother Haran. And they leave the area called Haran and they journey to the land of Canaan, which is, of course, Israel, where Avram builds an altar and he continues to spread the message of the one true God. Now, shortly after they get there, after all of the difficulty of leaving Haran and going to this strange place, a famine comes, and Avram makes the decision to leave for Egypt. It is his decision, it is not God's command. So God commanded him, leave Haran where you are, go to Canaan. A famine comes in Canaan. Avram decides, I have to feed my household. I'm going to go to Egypt. And of course, this part of the story, Sarai is taken to Paro's palace. And the only reason that Avram escapes death is because they have this little agreement that they are going to say that they are brother and sister. Okay. In the time that whoever's got your mic on,
Yes.
if you would mute yourself. Yeah, it's you. Yeah.
And-
Okay,
I
thank you. Whoever, I'm sorry. So the Paro, who is the name of the king of Egypt, he takes Sarai into his household, but he is unable to consummate his relationship with her because there's a plague that comes. We're going to talk about this in much more detail later. A plague that comes on him and his household. And he realizes something's going on because his trouble started when he brought Sarai into his house. So he goes back to Avram, and he says, "What is going on here? Why am I having all this trouble?" And they admit to him that they are not brother and sister, but they are husband and wife. Pharaoh sends Avram away with all kinds of riches, gold and silver and cattle, and also a maidservant, who we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So now they're back in the land of Canaan, and Lot separates from Avram because they have too much cattle and not enough pasture land, and their shepherds are arguing and coming to blows over who's allowed to bring their cattle or their animals to graze in which fields. And so they separate. And Lot settles in Sodom. That is an evil city that has a lot of bad, um, badly behaved people. And he fought, there's a big war between four kings and five kings, and he falls captive to in this war. And he Avram gets word that his nephew Lot has been captured, and he sets out with a small band of his folks to rescue his nephew. And he does in fact defeat the four kings and saves his nephew. The next episode is what we call in Hebrew the Bris Bein HaBasarim, but you probably know it as the covenant between the parts. It's a very sort of mystical experience where God tells Avram to line up all these animals, cut them in two, walk between the path. But basically, what's important here is that Avram gets a prophecy about the exile and the persecution of the people that are going to descend from him, who are the people of Israel, and what's going to happen to them with the land of Israel and so forth. So now Avram's had a couple of big communications with God. 10 years have passed. They are back in the land of Canaan, back in the land of Israel, and they are still childless. And so Sarai goes to her husband and says, "I want you to marry my maidservant Hagar." And Hagar conceives, and she becomes a problem now for Sarai. She becomes kind of haughty, and Sarai treats her, the rabbi said, harshly, and she runs away. In the desert, she meets up with an angel. Now, remember that she has been living in the house of Avram and Sarai, so it's not so unusual for her to have this sort of heavenly communication. Anyway, the angel convinces her to return and tells her that she will give birth to a son who will be the ancestor of a huge and important nation. And in fact, Yishmael, who is the son of Hagar, Yishmael literally means God will hear. And when Avram is 86 years old, Yishmael is born. 13 years later, God changes Avram's name to Avraham. Avraham means the father of multitudes, and changes Sarai's name from Sarai to Sarah, and promises them that a son will be born to them. And that from this child, who they should call Yitzhak, Isaac, literally it means, it's a future tense of laughter, like will laugh. From this son will be another great nation. So Yishmael, they already have the prophecy that Yishmael will be the father of one great nation. And now that they will have Avram will have another son, Yitzhak, who will be the ancestor of another great nation that God will establish with some special relationship. And at that point, Avram is commanded to circumcise himself and his descendants and his whole household as a covenant, which he complies with. Okay, that's the basic overview. Now, let's talk about what happened before Abraham was called upon to leave his land and his father's house. What was going on that the text does not tell us, but that adds some dimension to the story? So, according to tradition, Abraham was born in the year 1813 BCE. So, what is that, like uh three, four, almost 4,000 years ago? And he was born in what we now call Iraq, in a town called Ur Kasdim. He was born into a pagan culture and he practiced idolatry and he prayed to the sun because he believed that the sun created the heavens and the earth. But something didn't quite click because every day the sun would set and it was out of the picture. And then the moon and the stars dominated. And so he realized the sun has limitations. So then he said, okay, well, let me pray to the moon. Let me worship the moon. But with time, he realized that neither is the ultimate answer. So he came to the conclusion that there must be a single creator that is more powerful than either the sun or the moon. And that is how he became a monotheist. Like he figured it out himself. Nobody taught it to him. Abraham was absolutely convinced that the prevailing pagan beliefs of his community that they were wrong, and he started going around sharing his rationale and his thinking with everybody, and he was able to successfully persuade thousands of people to drop paganism in favor of his understanding of a single creator of the world. Now, he was very popular with the public and with people who liked his ideas, but his family and the leadership of Ur Kasdim, they were not so happy with him. And there's a story which I'm not going to get into, but he basically narrowly escaped uh, a situation where he refused to deify the emperor and he was forced to flee the country. And it's only after all of this, after years and years of working on himself spiritually and working on his understanding of who God is and what God is asking, that's when the book of Genesis in chapter 12 picks up the plot. That's when God calls him to come to Israel and tells him in this Torah portion that the whole subsequent history of his descendants, both the Jews and the Gentiles. Okay. So now you have like a little bit of a fuller picture connecting last week's Parsha, the end of Parshat Noach, to the beginning of this Parsha. All that stuff happened, but it isn't recorded in the written Torah. Let's take a closer look at a couple of verses in chapter 12 that jumped out at me. One is chapter 12, verse 3, when God says, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you. Now, I know this verse from Christian Zionists who taught me that they take this verse very seriously. Some take it to mean that if they support the Jewish people living in the land of Israel, who are descendants of Abraham, it, if they support them financially, that they themselves will prosper financially. That's one understanding. But let's go a little bit further back. The Abarbanel, who was a commentator from the 15th century, says those who bless you refer to those who connect to Abraham and his teachings, while the one who curses you refers to those who reject Abraham and his teachings. Okay. So it's not a question of financial support, it's a question of whether you align with Abraham and what he's teaching the world about. Valerie, I just saw your cat's butt. Okay. What he's teaching the world about the one true God. Okay. And let's look at the second part of that verse, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you. So the Radak, who's a 13th century commentator, it said that God, what God is saying to Abraham is that in order that the nations recognize and elevate you, I'm going to shower my blessings on you on the land wherever you're dwelling, whether you're in Canaan or in Egypt or whatever. Good fortune in those lands will come to those who treat Abraham and his descendants well. Interestingly enough, I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine about how the US for a very long time has been very blessed and very prosperous. And some would say, according to this verse, that it's because the US provided a haven for the Jews who were persecuted in Europe and in other countries. And there was huge waves of immigrants, of Jewish immigrants into the US in the early 20th century. That's when my great grandparents and grandparents, when they were little children, when they came to the US. So, according to this concept, the reason that America prospered is because for more than 100 years, they treated the Jews very, very well. However, now that anti-Semitism is again out in the open in the US, there's an interesting question of what will happen in America. I'm not going to go any deeper than that. I just wanted to mention that in association with chapter 12, verse 3. Let's look at chapter 12, verse 5. And Avram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possession that they had acquired. And this is the phrase I want you to listen to. And the souls that they had acquired in Haran, and they went to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to the land of Canaan. Okay, so first I want to say, when it says Avram took, the rabbis tell us that it does not mean by force. Avram did not take Sarai against her will, because that is not a Torah concept. A man is not permitted to just strap his wife onto the back of a horse or something and drag her to another country against her will. What it means is that he took her with soft words. He persuaded her with gentle words. He convinced her why this was appropriate to follow God. Now, Abraham, I told you, was born in Ur Kasdim, which is in Iraq. And his father, whose name is Terach, moved the family to Haran, which we believe is in modern day Turkey. So you can get some sense of where these folks are. And now it's time for them to move to Canaan, move to Israel. But what I wanted to focus on is this concept of the souls that they had acquired. What does that mean exactly? Okay. So the rabbis say it means the souls that they brought under the wings of the divine presence, the souls of the people that they pulled out of paganism, out of idolatry, and taught them. Now, the Torah wasn't given yet. The Torah is not going to be given for many, many generations, but the Torah what we had, at least we talked about this last week, were the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide laws. We had some other things that Avram had figured out. So it's not that he converted them. You will sometimes see if that's not true. There's no Judaism yet. There's no Torah yet. There's nothing to convert them to. But it means that he brought them out of idol worship to believe in monotheism, to believe in the one true God. And the rabbis teach that for the Jewish people, this is the evidence that there is merit. It is the correct thing for a Jew to bring even a non-Jew closer to the creator and sustainer of the universe, which is something about what we're doing here. But even more so, one who teaches Torah to a child, not your own biological child, is also regarded as having made that child into a God-fearing individual. So let's say that you're a Torah teacher in a school, and the children in your class, they are not your biological children, but you get a certain amount of merit for teaching them Torah. That's the idea. Chapter 12, verse 7. We're not going to go through the whole thing verse by verse by verse, but these are verses that struck at me as something I wanted to add to, I wanted to elaborate on. And this is the verse. And the Lord appeared to Avram, and he said, quote, "To your seed I will give this land." Okay, meaning the land of Israel. And there he built an altar. That is, Avram built an altar to God who had appeared to him. Now, what's going on in the land of Canaan, in the land of Israel, whatever you called it at that time? What's going on? The Canaanites were in the process of conquering this land from the descendants of Shem. Okay, so we have to go back to last week's Torah portion. Noach had 3 sons, okay? And one of them was Shem, and one of them was Ham. He was the bad guy in the story last week and did some inappropriate things. When Noach divided up the world, among his three sons, he gave the land of Israel to Shem, the son of, and when Hashem promises Abraham he's going to give this land to your offspring, what he's saying is, I'm going to return it in the future to your descendants who are descendants of Shem. What's happening at this point is that Canaan, who's literally Canaan was the son of Ham, and his descendants were in the process of trying to take the land away from Shem and his descendants. Do you understand the what's going on here? I'm not sure. Can you tell me, am I explaining this clearly? There, okay. All right, good. Okay, so so God is promising Avram, don't be too worried about the Canaanites because they are not going to hold on to the land. I'm going to give it back to you and your descendants. Now, this famine comes to Canaan, and Abraham, he's hardly there. He hardly got there. He only just recently arrived, and he decides, as I said before, he's going to flee to Egypt when there's food. And when they arrive, his wife, who is still called Sarai at this point, is taken to the house of Paro, who marries her. And I told you before, he's unable to consummate the marriage. And the text tells us that this is in the merit of Sarai, but I want to go a little deeper. This is chapter 12, verse 7. And the Lord plagued Paro with great plagues, as well as his household, on account of Sarai, Avram's wife. Now, what's going on here? Okay. When Sarai and Paro are alone, because Paro thinks that he's married this beautiful foreign woman, she actually told him that she was a married woman, that the whole thing about brother, that was a ruse so that they didn't kill her husband. But Paro didn't believe her. And he accused her of saying that only just to put him off. When she saw that he didn't believe her, she prayed, and God gave her the ability to command an angel. So this is I'm going to read you this quote from the Midrash. That entire night, an angel stood, whip in hand. When she, meaning Sarai, ordered strike, that is to afflict him, the angel struck. And when she ordered desist, the angel desisted. What we're meant to understand is this great spiritual power of Sarai, that she was able to command an angel to protect her, so she was not violated in the house of Paro, in the house of Pharaoh. Sarah is listed as one of the 7 women prophetesses in our tradition. They are Sarah, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, Huldah, who you may not be so familiar with, Abigail, the wife of King David, and Queen Esther. She's also listed as one of the 4 most beautiful women in all of Tanakh. Sarah, Abigail again, Rachav, who we studied last year, and Esther again. Okay, so that's like a little bit about things that stuck out for me early on, but I want to really do a deep dive into the character of Hagar. So we'll look at Hagar in the Bible and then in the Midrash. So I already said that Hagar is an Egyptian slave woman whom Sarai, later Sarah, gives to Abraham, later Avram, later Abraham, as a wife who could bear a child that would be considered Sarah's. This arrangement is like what we have now, what we call a surrogate mother, that the one who carries the child and then another woman raises the child as her own. That was the intention of the plan. Sarai and Avram, initially their view of Hagar is that she's a surrogate, she's a maidservant. They don't refer to her by name, but Hagar, once she gets pregnant very quickly, the very first time that she's with Avram. She sees herself in a more elevated way, and she begins to look with contempt. This is in Genesis chapter 16, verse 4. She looks with contempt upon her mistress, who is, of course, Sarah. And Sarah, in turn, abuses her. We'll talk about that later, what exactly happened. But another opinion is that even though she was a maidservant who had gotten pregnant by her husband, she simply continued to treat her as an ordinary slave, but there's this dynamic here that Hagar is starting to see herself as Sarah's equivalent, as Sarah's peer. Okay. And this is some tension between them. Okay. Hagar is not having this. And rather than submit to the authority of Sarai, she runs away into the wilderness and she meets God's messenger who tells her that she needs to actually return and submit to Sarai because she's going to bear a son. And this is in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 16, verse 12, who will be, quote, a wild ass of a man. Now, just as a wild ass is not a domesticated creature, so what the angel is saying is that Hagar's son will never be subject to anyone and would live, quote, with his hand against everyone and, quote, in everyone's face. This is chapter 16, verse 12. This is the very, very foundation, biblical foundation for the behavior of Arab terrorists today, who are descended from Ishmael, who have this quality of being, can't control them, are against everyone. They are aggressors. They are wild. They are uncivilized. All of that stuff that the angel said to Hagar that was going to be true about her son is also true to this day of the Arab terrorists that are the descendants of this son that she's going to have. Interestingly enough, this angel makes this announcement to Hagar in a similar way. We see it in two other places in Tanakh that I could think of. Maybe there's others that Hannah gets a message that she is going to be the mother of Shmuel, of Samuel. And this name you probably don't know. Tselelponit is the mother of Shimshon, the mother of Samson. And she also is out in the field by herself. And she gets a message from an angel of God. In all three cases, the women are told that they're going to have a child. In all three cases, it's a son who's going to have some special destiny. And they're all addressed personally and not through their husbands. That makes it very interesting. Okay. Now, there's another angle on this, and that is that Hagar, who is a slave from Egypt, is in some ways what happens to her is a foreshadowing of what is going to happen to the Israelite nation. How so? Hagar in Hebrew could be read as Hagar, which means the alien. That Hagar is an alien in the house of Abraham, just like Israel will be aliens or Gerim in a foreign land. So Israel becomes Gerim in the land of Egypt. Also, Hagar is degraded in this, and that Avram's descendants, the Israelite nation, will ultimately be degraded. And God will hear the affliction of Avram's descendants, just like this messenger heard Hagar. So in fact, Hagar takes this message seriously and she returns to Sarai and bears a son who Avram names Yishmael because that's what the angel said you're supposed to name him. Now let's go through the story again a little bit deeper with some deeper rabbinic understanding. So the rabbis present Hagar as an Egyptian princess. She was born into the house of Paro, who was the king of Egypt, and given to Sarai and Avram as a gift. Remember that I told you that when Paro sent Avram and Sarai off, he gave them all kinds of wealth, gold and cattle and silver, and a maidservant. And that maidservant was his daughter, Hagar. Um, so Hagar grows up in the house of Avram and Sarai, and she becomes a monotheist like the rest of the household. She's first mentioned in chapter 16, verse 1, as the Egyptian maidservant. Sarai, Avram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. That's where we first hear her name. It's interesting considering how relatively few women are mentioned in the Torah by name, that Hagar's name is specifically, explicitly right there in the verse. You can't miss it. So the Torah doesn't explain, the text doesn't explain how Sarah came to have an Egyptian handmaiden or how many years she was with her before she was given to Avram as a surrogate. But the rabbis connected Abraham and Sarah's stay in Egypt during the years of the famine with this Egyptian handmaiden joining their family, and that's where they get this idea that she was given over by Paro, who said that Paro sees the miracles that are performed for Sarai in his household. He understands that she has spiritual gifts that he is not used to seeing in Egypt, because Egypt is full of black magic and idol worship and so forth. And he is a fan, if you will. Not that he wants to join them, but he says to his daughter, it would be better for my daughter to be a handmaiden in the house of Sarah and Abraham than to be a noblewoman in the palace of Egypt. So that's one opinion of what her background is. There's another opinion that she was born to Paro from one of his concubines, and that when Paro took Sarai as a wife, he wrote a marriage contract, and he wrote over that he's giving her all this property, gold and silver and slaves and land, and Hagar was just part of the package. She was, it's another opinion that that's how she came into Sarai's hands. There's another tradition that she was just a maidservant who had belonged to Sarai before she and Avram got married. And so she came into the household as part of her dowry. That after Sarai wed Avram, Hagar was continued to be the property of her mistress and not of her mistress's husband. And that explains why, in the continuation of this narrative, Sarah is the one who determines Hagar's fate, who she's going to marry, how much labor is going to be demanded of her, when she's going to be sent away from the house, and so forth. Okay, so so now 10 years have elapsed. They're in the land of Canaan. Sarah is getting older. She has not conceived. She comes up with this idea, and she wants to persuade Hagar to marry Abraham. Um, and so this, as I mentioned before, this doesn't go very well. She kind of takes advantage, Hagar takes advantage of her status in order to disparage Sarah in the eyes of others. There's even an idea that Avram himself grew close to Hagar, that he stopped viewing her as a handmaiden and sort of as a junior wife. But because Hagar's official status was that she was still part of Sarah. This is very weird to us, this whole concept of handmaidens and some kind of modified form of indentured servitude or whatever. But her destiny was in Sarah's hands. And so Avram understood that, but he also did what he could to protect her. So there is an opinion that Sarah, when she started getting uppity, I'm going to call it, when Hagar started getting uppity, that Sarah treated her handmaiden harshly and abused her in various ways. That's what caused her to run away. She's depicted by the rabbis as being strongly influenced by the atmosphere in the house of Abraham and Sarah. That so much so I mentioned before that she was accustomed to seeing angels, and so she wasn't alarmed, or she didn't freak out when an angel was revealed to her privately in the wilderness. And there's a lesson in that. The lesson in that is that, well, it's a two-part lesson as it relates to Hagar, that the spiritual level of Hagar as a handmaiden to Sarah was higher than that of people from previous generations. But also the lesson today for us is spiritually who we spend our time with, who we are, who we engage with on a regular basis. If they are on a spiritual level that we aspire to, that has an influence on us. If they are on a lower spiritual level than we are on, that can harm our spiritual growth and development. So even Hagar, who was Egyptian, she wasn't even from the family of Abraham. She benefited from being around this holy couple, this holy household, and so forth. Okay, so that's the takeaway. So okay, Sarah, um, in chapter 16, verse 2, this is where she goes to Abraham and she says, consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a son through her. Now, Avram doesn't really want to do this, but he knows that Sarah is a prophetess, meaning she gets messages directly from God. You remember that I told you that she's one of the 7 women prophetesses who is recorded in our tradition. Um, so he does agree, but his marriage to Hagar is considered one of the 10 trials to which God subjected Abraham. Now, this you may have you heard of this idea that there were the 10 trials of Abraham? And I'm going to go through them with you. That God tested him over and over and over again. And the first 6 of them come in this week's parsha. The first test is God tells him, leave your homeland, go to this strange land that I'm going to send you. I'm going to send you to. I'm not going to tell you where it is. I'm not going to tell you what you're going to do there. I'm just telling you, leave everything that's familiar to you and just blindly follow me. That was the first trial. The second is that immediately after his arrival, there's a famine. So God says, he goes to the place that God tells him to go to very specifically, and he gets there and there's no food. The third trial, we've talked about this, is that the Egyptian seize his wife and bring her to Pharaoh. The fourth trial in the life of Abraham is the battle of the 4 kings and the 5 kings when he goes to save his nephew Lot. There are massive armies, one of whom has taken his nephew Lot as a hostage, and he has a small band of followers, and he faces incredible odds to you can imagine like that would be a incredibly frightening thing, and you would have to have a lot of emuna to be able to go and retrieve your nephew. The fifth one is that he marries Hagar after not being able to have children with Sarah. So he doesn't really want to do this. It's considered a trial, and he does it, as I said, because Sarah is a prophetess and he listens to her, but he does it reluctantly. The sixth is at the end of this parsha where God tells him to circumcise himself. He's an old man already. Circumcision is when Jews do circumcision on an 8-day-old baby, it's a relatively simple procedure. But if a grown man who was not circumcised as a child decides that he wants to join the Jewish people, he has to go through circumcision, and it is major surgery, like anesthesia and like the whole thing. So to tell an old man to circumcise himself, that is no small thing. The last 4 happen in future parshiot, but I'm going to tell you what they are. The king of Gerar captures Sarah. This is a replay of she's captured by Paro, the king of Egypt. God tells him to send Hagar away after they've had a child together. So although he is reluctant to couple with her to begin with, once they do that and they produce a child, and he is told, now send your second wife, however he thinks of her, and your child away, that's not easy for him. And he becomes, the 9th trial is that he becomes estranged from this child Ishmael. And the 10th, the big one, anybody know what the 10th trial of Abraham is? You can unmute yourself and say if you know.
The Akedah.
Yeah. The Akedah, right? The binding of Isaac, that he has to go and now sacrifice the son that is still with him on this altar. So these are the 10 trials of Abraham. Okay, so again, Sarah takes Hagar, gives her to Abraham. According to the Midrash, she didn't take her by force, even though she was like the boss of her. She convinced her using words by talking about how holy Abraham was and what an honor it would be to partner with him. Okay. Now, the Torah's description, you'll find this in chapter 16, verse 4. The Torah's description of Hagar's impregnation says he cohabited with Hagar and she conceived. So the commentators understand from from this verse, that she immediately became pregnant, that they were only together one time and she became pregnant. And the point is to emphasize that the relationship between Abraham and Hagar, it's not a love match. It has a defined purpose. The purpose is to produce an offspring. So there's no IDF back in this in these times. They have to actually physically be together, but not over and over and over again. So the very first time, God blesses this union and she gets pregnant. Um, there's a midrash, there's a commentary that this is where things went bad. As soon as she conceives, things go bad between her and Sarah, that other wealthy or well-known women in the community come to ask about Sarah, and Hagar would basically diss her, and she would say, um, she's not like what you think she's like. It looks like she's all righteous, but she's really, I'm obviously paraphrasing. If she was righteous, then would she be barren? See how many years that she tried to become pregnant, and I became pregnant in a single night. So how great could she be? This is what the rabbis say Hagar was saying against Sarah. So she's not only one who acted disrespectfully to Sarah, but she also caused other people to denigrate or to think less of Sarah. We talked about this last year in the lesson on Lashon Hara, that um, one of the ill effects of it is not just on the person who's speaking it or the person about whom it is spoken, but the person who hears gossip or evil speech about a third party, and it changes their opinion of that person. Okay. So basically, Hagar takes advantage of her quick pregnancy to besmirch the good, excellent reputation of her mistress. Now, Sarah is depicted as she knows, she's well aware of her her goodness, her station in life, and she is not going to descend to the level of Hagar and argue with her. Um, and the rabbis say that the fact that she does not argue with her or she doesn't try to defend herself accentuates the the moral differences between them and the class differences between them. So you can sort of imagine this drama that Sarah is taking the high road, right? She's not prepared to go down into the nasty pit where Hagar is behaving from. However, she does she does cause some difficulties. So in chapter 16, verse 5, it's not like she's not impacted by it. She chooses not to respond to it, but she is impacted by it. She's angry. And she goes to her husband, and this is the verse. And Sarai said to Avram, may my injustice be upon you. I gave my handmaid into your bosom, and she saw that she had become pregnant, and I became unimportant in her eyes. May the Lord judge between me and you. Okay, there's a lot of stuff in here, but for this purpose, I'm just going to say, and this is something a lot of people don't realize, that from what Sarah said, Hagar miscarried. From the power of Sarai's anger, she miscarried. And so when she later encounters the angel of the Lord in the wilderness, and he tells her, you are in this is chapter 16, verse 11, you are going to bear a son. When she comes back, like she actually is with Avram a second time, and she conceives again a second time, and that is the pregnancy that results in Ishmael. Okay. Now, um, I told you before that Avram is ambivalent. We can see this in chapter 16, verse 6, when he says, your maid is in your hands, deal with her as you think right. This is his answer to his wife, who was angry and maybe hurt, and coming to him with this heavy thing. And he says, do what you think is best. So we see a little bit of his ambivalence because he doesn't seem to be terribly concerned about Hagar, that and yet we've heard that I told you before that it's hard for him to send her off, and and so he doesn't want to say, you have my full support. I mean, he does sort of say that she's yours to do with as you want, but it's hard for him. So there's all this family drama going on in this family, all this trouble that Hagar has stirred up. So there's one, I found this really interesting. This one rabbinic explanation of what exactly did Sarah do to her besides just the curse that caused her to miscarry the first point. So the rabbis say that there are three things. That number one, she prevented her from engaging in sexual relations. She threw her shoe in Hagar's face, and she had her um, sort of working to clean up the bathhouse, the pails of water, the clothing that the household was using in the bathhouse. Those are all specific ways that Sarah was um, emphasizing her role in this relationship. Now, let's just go into that a little bit more. In the first interpretation, that she prevented Hagar from engaging in sexual relations, she prevented Hagar from being with her husband again after she was became pregnant the second time. Because Sarah wants to give Hagar and Avram the message that she's the real wife in the household. And although Hagar has been with him intimately twice, um, it was Sarah who made that happen, and it's Sarah who can make that not happen anymore. So it's not like once they were together, they had this ongoing, in any way, romantic relationship or ongoing encounters. They were together twice. Both times she conceived. The first time she miscarried, the second time she conceived Ishmael. The second understanding, that she threw her shoe in Hagar's face, the message was one of class. And this is what the rabbis say: shoes are, we wear them on the lowest part of the body. And she's trying to remind her that Hagar that she does not have the same social standing, spiritual standing, marital standing as her mistress. She still serves the family as a handmaiden, and Sarah can remind her of that. I don't know a lot about this, but I have heard that in the Middle East, in the culture in the Middle East, that something about the shoe is considered very demeaning. I'd have to look into that, but I've heard that in a way that like Westerners don't necessarily relate to shoes. Hi, Ginny, is it your birthday today? No? Okay. Well, happy belated birthday. And there she goes. Okay. Um, Okay, and according to the third thing that Sarah allegedly did was that she had Hagar go to the bathhouse and clean up the pails and the clothes and so forth. That Sarah's primary goal was in fact to subjugate her and make her work a little bit harder, even though she was at this point she is pregnant again. That she wanted to teach Hagar that even though she is carrying the fetus of Abraham in her uterus, she's still a handmaiden and she still has to perform the household duties. Okay. Um, and then of course we have the whole incident where um Sarah's treating her harshly. Hagar flees to the wilderness. The angel finds her. Um, and listen to this, because in verse 8, it's very important to understand what is her true status, because the rabbis say the angel said to her, Hagar, comma, slave of Sarai. And she answers him in verse 8, and she says, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. So the rabbis assert that the angel helped Hagar understand what is her true standing. And she went through sort of a process of change. So she stopped being so haughty in the way that we spoke about it before and started being a little bit more humble and understanding her role. She had also in verse 6, apparently when Avram told Sarai, your mate is in your hand, she overheard that. And now she hears the slave calling her, I'm sorry, the angel calling her Hagar, slave of Sarai. So now she's starting to internalize that this is her status, and it is reflected in her own words when she refers to herself as running away from her mistress Sarai. Okay. Um, let's in chapter 16, verse 12. This is where the angel tells her what the nature of the child that she is going to bear is going to be. We spoke about this a little before. Here's the full verse. He will be a wild ass of a man. His hand will be upon all, and everyone's hand upon him. And before his brothers he will dwell. So the angel is portraying to Hagar the personality and the actions of this son who's going to be born. And they are trying to cast light on the negative character of Yishmael. And that's the reason why Yishmael cannot be the successor to Abraham. Yes, he is just as much a son to Abraham as Yitzhak, as Isaac will be, he's not born yet in this scenario. But the rabbis in general, Hagar is inferior to Sarai, and Yishmael is inferior to Yitzhak. Okay. Um, and Hagar herself claims that she spoke with God, but in fact, it is Sarah, the prophetess, who had the spiritual potential to actually speak with God himself when he informs her of the birth of Yitzhak. She was the true prophetess. Um, so she sees this angel and she thinks she's talking to God. And she's able to get pregnant right away, and her mistress is not able to get pregnant right away. So you can understand why in her less spiritually developed head, she originally comes to this conclusion of her own importance, inflated importance, and how the story plays out, she is kind of put in her place. Sarah is clearly spiritually superior to Hagar, and therefore her descendants are the descendants of Sarah are more spiritually worthy than the descendants of Hagar. Okay. And with this, I'll end. This story is the biblical beginning of the root of the conflict between Jews, who are the descendants of Abraham through Yitzhak, and the Arabs, who are the descendants of Abraham through Ishmael. This is the reason, you may be very well aware of this, but this is the reason why it's kind of dead in the water right now. But we had a couple of 4 years ago or so what was called the Abraham Accords. The idea was to unite all of the nations that come from Abraham. And I'll just finish. I know I said I was going to finish. I have a couple more minutes. I just want to finish with this idea because I find this fascinating. There are two times in the Torah when God promises Abraham that his descendants are going to inherit this land. And there's two completely different geographical descriptions. The first time he tells Abraham, it's a very expanded landmass that he says your children will inherit. The second time, it's a much smaller landmass. What does that mean? Think of the Middle East today. Okay, all the surrounding lands surrounding the land of Israel are in the hands of the descendants of Abraham. They are. Just as God promised. But the land of Israel, which is the portion that became the inheritance of his children through Yitzhak and through Sarah's son Yitzhak, meaning the Israelite nation, meaning the Jewish people, that's a much smaller area of land. So the idea is that at the end of days, when God restores everything to the way it's supposed to be, the land of Israel will expand to include the entire inheritance of the very first time that God tells Abraham, your children are going to inherit all this land. It's an interesting question. Who's going to populate that land? Because there aren't enough Jews. If you brought every Jew in the world back to this region, there's not enough of us to populate that huge landmass. And so some people are of the opinion, and some people are even working towards bringing non-Jews who are aligned with Torah to come and populate that the land. That I don't know, I don't have prophecy. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but that is one scenario. Um, Another scenario is that I have heard is that all through Latin America and people who are descended from Spanish speaking countries who were conversos, they were Jews who were forced to convert under penalty of death or expulsion, that they and their descendants, so we're talking about 500 years, so it's like tens of millions of people, 100, I don't know how many people it is, that they will be restored to the nations. There are people, of course, that believe about themselves that they are descended from the 10 lost tribes. There are also actual categories of people of the 10 lost tribes. I don't know who's going to populate the land, but it's a fascinating thing to think about, that this conflict between the Jews and the Arabs goes all the way back to this relationship between Abraham and Hagar, and Sarah and Hagar, and Yishmael and Yitzhak, and that we are hopefully living in the generation when this is all going to resolve itself. Okay. So there's no way for me to take an hour and teach you everything that I would want you to know about each parsha, but this particular week, this is what I prepared to share with you. As I said, that I wanted to focus on a summary of the Parsha, which I did, and the non-Jewish characters in the Parsha, and especially about women. So here I got lucky because I had a character who was not from the family of Abraham, and who was also a woman. So that was pretty cool. I did think about, like, there's a bunch of other characters in this Parsha, including Pharaoh, who is also from outside the family. And but I didn't have time to do all of it. So that's what I did. In our last remaining minutes, does anybody have anything they want to ask, or any burning questions, or any I see that I missed a chat. Oh, it's your husband's birthday. Oh, okay. Um, okay. Anybody have anything? Yes, Natalie, you want to say something? You have to unmute yourself.
Good.
There you go.
Yeah, it's always tricky to do it on my phone. Yeah, what do you think about when you speak about the big Israel, about Ezekiel 36-37, where there is Judah and Ephraim coming back together?
So some people, the way Valerie, you're probably smirking right now because you could probably answer this question better than I can, but there's different ways of understanding this. One is the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, right? The southern kingdom being Judah, the Jews, and the northern kingdom being the 10 lost tribes. There's an entirely different way of understanding that. And that is Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. So Mashiach ben Yosef comes from from Yosef, who's in the north, and Mashiach ben David comes from the south, and that at the end of days, they will work together to bring about redemption. Now, I don't know what that means, because there most of the people in the Torah world that I've spoken to about the claim of people who believe about themselves that they are descended from the 10 lost tribes. I'm talking about not like the Ethiopians who are from Dan, or the B'nai Menashe who are from Menashe, like the groups that stay together, but individuals who believe that their attraction to Torah must be because they came from one of those tribes. I I hope I live long enough to see all that stuff play out. but I don't know. I can't say in any specific way. It's not an idea that has a lot of support in the Jewish world. And I don't even know because it's been a few years since I have been actively in contact with people from that world. I think time will tell.
Mhm.
So,
Okay.
yeah,
What's very interesting is like I read it again not so long ago, and I've never seen it before, but they were saying that it was Ephraim who was coming back to be with Judah. That is not Judah who is going to be with Ephraim, is Ephraim
correct,
coming. It's
correct.
interesting that
Right. But one of
yeah.
one of the problems that we have right now is
Mhm,
that Ephraim does not wants to reunite in the greater house, as I understand, in the greater house of Israel without actually becoming Jewish, meaning without actually giving up Yeshua. They want to be brothers or siblings, however you understand that, but they want to hold on to their Christian understanding of things. And
mhm,
that's not this is really complicated stuff. And Valerie's really an expert on this way more than I am, but this is not something that Judah can accept.
mhm,
Because we can't have a united house of Israel when we have beliefs that lie outside of the domain of Torah. But we're not there, we're not there yet. So I don't know what's going to happen. I have like my Christian students have one scenario for the end of days and how that's going to all play out, and I have a different one. And for right now, we're just focusing on what we have in common and what kinds of things we share, and we'll see what surprises God has in store for all of us. Vicky, do you want to say something, or you're just okay? Happy with that answer? Great. Okay. Wait, one more minute or so. Does anybody have anything? Okay. So thank you again for being the faces that I get to look at. Teresa, I hope you get to your destination safely. And God willing, I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you so much, Rivka.
Pleasure.
Fantastic.
Thanks so much. Bye, guys.